Imagine a summer where the sun is a ghost, the rain is black, and snow falls in June. This is how the world almost ended. Part 1. The Spark. 1815 was supposed to be the Great Exhale. For 25 years, Europe had been a blood-soaked chessboard, moved by the iron will of Napoleon Bonaparte. But finally, the nightmare was over. The emperor was in exile. The borders were being redrawn over fine wine in Vienna, and for the first time in a generation, a young man could look at a field and think of harvests, not graves. The world was ready for a long, warm, boring peace. But 7,000 miles away, on the island of Sumbawa, the Earth was preparing its own version of a global reset. Mount Tambora stood nearly 13,000 feet tall, a silent titan of the Dutch East Indies that had been dormant for 3 centuries. On April 5th, it began to cough. The sound was so massive that it traveled across the ocean to Java, where the British Lieutenant Governor Sir Stamford Raffles stood in total confusion. He didn't think volcano. In 1815, a noise like that meant only one thing: war. Raffles was convinced an enemy armada was bombarding the coast. He sent his soldiers to the ramparts, preparing for a human conflict, unaware that he was listening to the most powerful sound ever recorded in human history. Then came April 10th, the day the mountains simply stopped existing. It wasn't a leak, it was a planetary detonation. Tambora disintegrated. 150 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and fire were punched into the sky with the force of 30 million Hiroshima bombs. The explosion was heard 1,600 miles away. If you were standing in London and a mountain in Istanbul blew up, you would have heard it just as clearly. The local carnage was absolute. Rivers of superheated gas, moving at the speed of a jet engine, wiped the kingdoms of Sungar and Pekot off the map in seconds. 10,000 people were atomized instantly. But as the fire settled, a much more sinister transformation was happening 40 kilometers above the clouds. Tambora had injected 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide gas into the stratosphere. Up there, the gas reacted with moisture to form a shimmering, microscopic veil of sulfate aerosols. This was the ash ghost, a trillion tiny mirrors that began to wrap themselves around the planet like a gray funeral shroud. By late 1815, this invisible invader had hitched a ride on the high-altitude winds. It didn't care about the borders redrawn in Vienna. It drifted over China, breaking the monsoon patterns. It drifted over Europe, where the first sign of trouble wasn't the cold, but a haunting, sickly light. In London, the sun began to look wrong. It was a pale, ghostly wafer that you could stare at with the naked eye at high noon. The sunsets turned a violent, bruised crimson colors so strange that the painter, J.M.W. Turner, obsessed over them, painting the ash ghost into his canvases without even knowing its name. The world was enchanted by the eerie beauty of the sky, unaware they were looking at the funeral of the global climate. The sulfate veil was doing its job, reflecting the sun's warmth back into the cold void of space. The gears of the seasons had been jammed. The Great Peace was about to be replaced by a great hunger that would bring civilization to its knees. The sun was failing, the frost was coming, and the world was about to learn that peace meant nothing if the sky refused to wake up. Part 2. The Escalation. The Shattered Harvest. Early 1816 was a lethal illusion. January and February were unexpectedly mild, coaxing New England farmers into a false peace. They looked at the clear sky and planned their spring, believing the previous year's blood-red sunsets were merely an atmospheric quirk. They had no idea they were standing in the eye of a volcanic hurricane made of Indonesian soot. Then, the gears of the world's climate machine finally snapped. By April, the dry fog arrived, a persistent, reddish-brown haze that tasted of sulfur and felt like grit between the teeth. It was a shroud that refused to lift. You could stare at the sun at high noon and see sunspots with the naked eye, shielded by a veil of dust. that had traveled 7,000 miles to choke the light. It was the physical manifestation of the stratosphere's rebellion, and the signal that the Earth's warmth was being cut off. In May, the thermal whiplash began. This was the cruelest part of the disaster. The weather became schizophrenic. Temperatures would soar to 80 degrees, coaxing seeds out of the soil with a whisper of summer, only to plummet 50 degrees in a single night. It teased life out of the ground just to crush it with a fist of ice 48 hours later. On June 6th, 1816, the complexity hit a breaking point. Families in Vermont woke to a silence so profound it felt like the end of history. They pushed open their doors to find a foot of snow in the middle of summer. Their corn, the lifeblood of the frontier, didn't just die. It flash froze and shattered like glass. The sound of 1,000 stalks breaking at once was the sound of a regional economy disintegrating. This wasn't just a weather event. It was a global fuel crisis. In 1816, horses were the engines, and grain was the gasoline. When the crops shattered, the fuel price quadrupled. Farmers faced a horrific, cold-blooded math. Feed the children or feed the horse that allowed them to plow. Thousands chose their children. Across the Northeast, roads were littered with the carcasses of horses, their ribs pushing through hides, abandoned because their oats were more expensive than gold. As the horses died, the supply chain snapped. News stopped, trade died, and the rural world became a prison of ice. This systemic collapse triggered Ohio fever. Driven by rumors of a sun that still shone in the west, thousands abandoned their homes. They nailed boards over windows and began a funeral march toward the frontier. Among them was the family of young Joseph Smith, pushed toward New York by 3 years of failure. The Year Without a Summer was redrawing the map of the United States, forcing the frontier west because the east had become a graveyard. Across the Atlantic, the same ghost strangled Europe. The Napoleonic Wars had left granaries empty. When 8 weeks of black, toxic rain hit Ireland and the UK, wheat fields turned into stinking swamps. As bread vanished, the social contract dissolved. In Switzerland and France, the Great Hunger turned veterans of Waterloo into bread rioters. Governments tried to frame the disaster as a temporary setback, but you cannot spin an empty stomach. The world discovered a terrifying truth. Modern civilization was a fragile clockwork, and one mountain in Indonesia had just jammed the gears. In the dark, the only options left were to move, to innovate, or to start imagining monsters that could survive the frost. Part 3. The Villa of Nightmares. While the frozen Pilgrims of America were abandoning their homesteads, a different drama unfolded on the shores of Lake Geneva. In the summer of 1816, Switzerland was meant to be an escape for the British elite, a place of alpine sunlight. But the ash ghost had no respect for vacations. Travelers found a Gothic wasteland instead. The rain that year didn't just fall, it conquered. It was a dark, sulfurous downpour that lasted for weeks, turning the lake into a cauldron of gray mud. The thunder was so constant, it felt like a distant echo of Tambora still screaming. Trapped inside the Villa Diodati were Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and 18-year-old Mary Godwin. They were the generation of peace, but looking out their windows, they saw only an apocalypse. This was the ultimate lockdown. Driven to the edge of madness by cabin fever and the dread of a sunless world, Byron issued a challenge. We will each write a ghost story. For Mary, the challenge was a torment. Night after night, she listened to the men discuss galvanism, the terrifying science of using electricity to make dead muscles twitch. In a world where people were dropping dead from hunger just miles away, the line between life and death felt dangerously thin. The Year Without a Summer had turned the planet into a cemetery, and Mary was breathing its dust. Then came the waking dream. During a violent thunderstorm, Mary didn't imagine a ghost. She saw a machine made of flesh. She saw a student kneeling beside a patchwork of corpses, brought to life by a spark of stolen lightning. This was the birth of Frankenstein, The monster was a perfect reflection of 1816. The creature is a wanderer, cold, hungry, and rejected, much like the frozen pilgrims marching west. He is a child of the ash, born into a world where nature has turned hostile and the creator has walked away. He is the existential scream of a generation realized they were not the masters of the earth. While Mary dreamed of her monster, Byron's physician, John Polidori, created the vampire. He transformed folk ghouls into the modern vampire, an aristocratic predator who drains the life force of the living. It was a searing metaphor for an era where the elite stayed warm in villas while the poor were drained of their lives. By famine, the Villa Diodati became a laboratory of the human psyche. In that dark summer, the ash ghost forced us to confront our shadows. We didn't just get scary books, we got the foundation of science fiction. We learned that when the physical world collapses, the mind builds monsters to inhabit the ruin. 1816 taught us our fragility. But while the poets dreamed of monsters, a more literal demon was waking up. As the monsoons failed in the east, a bacteria in Bengal was mutating into a global killer. The Year Without a Summer was about to deliver its most lethal legacy, the first pandemic of cholera. Part 4. The Iron Horse and the Hungry Ghost. By late 1816, the world had become a silent graveyard for a specific kind of technology, the horse. We often forget that for millennia, the horse was not a luxury. It was the battery, the engine, and the internet of human civilization. If the horse stopped, the world stopped. And in 1816, the horses were stopping by the millions. As the price of oats climbed toward the stratosphere, the logic of the stable became a brutal math of survival. A horse eats roughly 5 to 10 pounds of grain a day. In a world where families fought over a handful of moldy flour, keeping a horse alive was an act of economic suicide. Across the German states and the British countryside, the sound of the era was the silence of empty stalls and the dull thud of carcasses being dragged to the rendering pits. The biological engine had finally run out of fuel, but necessity is a cold, hard teacher. In the Grand Duchy of Baden, a man named Karl von Drace was watching this collapse with the eyes of a frustrated inventor. His horses were either dead or too weak to carry a rider. The ash ghost had stolen his fuel, so Drace decided he would become the engine himself. He sat in his workshop, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and the chill of a summer that felt like a permanent October. He designed a wooden frame with 2 wheels and a line, a padded seat, and a tiller for steering. There were no pedals that would come later. To move, you had to kick the ground, running while sitting. He called it the Laufmaschine, the running machine. When Drace first took his wooden contraption out onto the muddy roads, people laughed. It looked ridiculous. A man straddling a beam of wood, frantically kicking at the dirt. They called it the dandy horse. But they weren't laughing for long. Drace had realized something fundamental. When the biological system fails, you must move toward the mechanical. He had invented the ancestor of the modern bicycle, not because he wanted to exercise, but because a volcano in Indonesia had made the horse obsolete. It was the first zero-emission vehicle, born from the absolute failure of the global food supply. But while Drace was trying to outrun the famine, a much more terrifying, hungry ghost was waking up in the east. The ash ghost in the stratosphere had broken the heartbeat of the Indian Ocean. The monsoons were late, and when they arrived, they brought chaos. The disrupted climate created a feast or famine cycle of drought and flash floods in the Ganges Delta. In these brackish waters, a bacteria called Vibrio cholerae mutated, becoming more aggressive and lethal. Because famine had weakened the immune systems of millions, the hungry ghost found a planet-sized buffet. This was the birth of the first great cholera pandemic. It hitched a ride on the British East India Company's ships, moving like a shadow along trade routes. Cholera was the Blue Death. It didn't just kill you, it hollowed you out. Within hours, a healthy person would turn a ghostly shade of blue as their body was literally drained of fluid. People began to associate the ash ghost in the sky with the blue ghost in the water. They believed the end of the world was coming by air and by sea. By 1817, cholera had established a global beachhead. 1816 was the forge of the modern world. It gave us the bicycle because we couldn't feed our animals. And it gave us the modern public health system because we couldn't ignore the blue corpses. We were learning, painfully, that a volcano in the East Indies could change the water in London. As the skies finally cleared, humanity realized it was no longer the same species that had toasted to peace in Vienna. We had been through the frost. We had seen the monsters. Now, we had to build a new world in the returning sunlight. Part 5. The Legacy. The Modern Connection. By late 1817, the ash ghost finally began to dissolve. The shimmering veil of sulfate aerosols, which had held the earth in a cold, suffocating grip for 2 years, was washed away by the very rains it helped create. The sun regained its golden fury, and the great hunger subsided as harvests finally returned to Europe and New England. On the surface, the world seemed to return to normal. But normal was a ghost buried in the frost of 1816. You cannot starve millions and kill the primary mode of transport without leaving a permanent scar on the DNA of human civilization. 1816 was the birth of the modern world's contradictions. Look at the map of the United States. The year without a summer acted like an atmospheric hammer, smashing the population of the East and scattering it into the Ohio River Valley. This migration wasn't just about moving people. It was about moving ideas. It paved the way for the Industrial Revolution and accelerated the displacement of indigenous peoples. Even the spiritual landscape was altered. The family of Joseph Smith, pushed to New York by 3 years of failed crops, would go on to found the Mormon faith, a movement born directly from the despair of a frozen field. Without Tambora, the religious and political geography of America would look entirely different today. In Europe, the scars were deeper. Monarchs realized their crowns were only as secure as the price of bread. This led to the creation of the first modern social safety nets and public health initiatives, born not from kindness, but from the terror of cholera. We learned that a disease in a delta 7,000 miles away was a local problem for a city in Germany. We learned that in a globalized world, there is no such thing as somewhere else. The interconnectivity we take for granted today was forged in the hungry desperation of 1816. Then there is the mechanical legacy. Karl von Dreiss's wooden Laufmaschine sparked a fascination with self-propelled movement that would lead to the pneumatic tire and the automobile. There is a profound irony here. A climate disaster caused by a volcano forced us to invent a machine that would eventually contribute to our own modern climate crisis. The bicycle was our first escape from the limitations of animal muscle, a leap into a future powered by engineering rather than oats. But the most haunting legacy is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It remains the ultimate metaphor for our age, a story about the consequences of playing God with nature. In 1816, humanity felt like the creature, abandoned in a world turned cold and hostile. Today, we face a mirror image of that crisis. We are living through our own version of the ash ghost, though this time, we are the ones who put it there. Our modern supply chains are just as fragile as the horse-drawn economy of 1816. We are still frozen pilgrims, searching for a frontier, hoping the sun stays a friend rather than an enemy. 1816 taught us that resilience is about what you build while the rain is falling. Out of the blackest rain, we pulled the sparks of a bicycle, a masterpiece of horror, and a new way of living together. Tambora is still there, a silent titan in the Indonesian sea, slowly building its pressure. It reminds us that we are guests on a planet that does not care about our borders. We are the children of the frost, survivors of a summer that never came. Our history is the story of how we learned to dance in the dark. The sun is out today. Let's make sure we don't take its warmth for granted.